In 1948, some 700,000 Arab Palestinians were expelled from their homes at the point of Zionist guns in a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing remembered by its victims and their descendants as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Far from some unforeseeable horror, the Zionist movement called for such violent displacement from the start, the movement's founders proudly adopting the label colonizers in an attempt to paint themselves as a civilizing force in accord with the designs of the leading power of the day, the British Empire. Consequently, the communist movement opposed Zionism in no uncertain terms, with the so-called Pope of Marxism, Karl Kautsky, writing in 1910 that, quote, Palestine does not belong to the Jews of Vienna, London, or New York, who claim it for Judaism, but to the Arabs of the same country, the great majority of the population. Why then did Stalin renege in 1947, offering Zionism crucial material support at a time when the movement's future was uncertain? Vladimir Lenin, Stalin's predecessor in both leadership of the Soviet Union and the international communist movement, was a consistent opponent of Zionism, correctly arguing in 1903 that the Zionist idea was, quote, absolutely false and essentially reactionary. Far from an isolated statement, Lenin made his thinking on the matter clear repeatedly. The Zionist idea, which is being used to divert the Jewish proletariat from the class struggle, is counter-revolutionary, petty bourgeois, and utopian. Though Stalin proclaimed his political thought to be Marxism-Leninism, a synthesis and extension of the ideas of Marx and Lenin, his support for Zionism contradicts the precedent set by the men whose legacy he enlisted for support. Today's Stalinists tend to feel differently. By and large, they simply refrain from commenting upon Stalin's support for Zionism, either because they don't know it themselves or because they appreciate its indefensibility. When the subject is broached, as it sometimes is in more casual, conversational spaces like Reddit, most Stalinists will admit the mistake, but in such a way that deprives the admission of meaning. As one Redditor puts it, in the thread's most upvoted comment, quote, he was wrong, but how could he have predicted how far it would go? In that time, the Jewish people were facing systematic extinction not a decade prior, so giving them a homeland, like tried before the war, didn't seem out of place. You should be glad the Soviet Union was quick to recant his position like a Marxist-Leninist state is supposed to do over time. It's hard not to see parallels with well-meaning liberals who, when confronted with the realities of the Vietnam and Iraq wars, express solemn regret for the United States' mistakes. Stalin's mistake, however, was calculated. It had to be, for it flew in the face of his own prior anti-Zionism. It was none other than Stalin himself who condemned Zionism as a reactionary nationalist trend of the Jewish bourgeoisie, which had followers among the intellectuals and the more backward section of the Jewish workers. The Zionists endeavored to isolate the Jewish working class masses from the general struggle of the proletariat. Under Stalin's direction, Soviet diplomats took a distinctly pro-Arab stance during the riots of 1929 and 1936. It is therefore no surprise that upon hearing of Stalin's support for Zionism, Dean Rusk, the then head of the UN desk at the U.S. State Department, declared himself, quote, puzzled by the novelty of what seemed to be a pro-Zionist Soviet policy. If outsiders were puzzled, however, those in the know were less taken aback. Though officially hostility to Zionism was largely maintained, behind the scenes, evidence of a softening stance had been accumulating for years. As early as 1941, while the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact between the Soviets and the Nazis remained in effect, meetings were had between leading Zionist figures and Soviet diplomats, in which the former attempted to persuade the latter to their cause. If they initially failed to win Soviet favor, neither were they rebuffed. The Zionist angle was straightforward. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's infamous secret provisions for the partition of Poland meant much of the country's substantial Jewish population suddenly found themselves unwilling citizens of the USSR. Needing colonists to realize its colonial ambitions, Zionists saw this as an opportunity. Perhaps these formerly Polish citizens, robbed of their true nationality, would prefer a new one. Although the Soviet Union would ultimately disallow for immigration to Israel, quickly leading to a deterioration of relations between the two, over 100,000 Polish Jews would settle in Israel in 1948, proving that the Zionist assumption was sound. The Soviet perspective was even more opportunistic. When the Soviets finally repelled the Nazi invasion in 1943, thus turning the tide of the war solidly in favor of the Allied powers, attention shifted to establishing the shape of the post-war order. In this, a key concern of both the Soviet Union and the United States was the dissolution of the British Empire, and it was quickly realized that Zionism could prove essential in expediting that process in the Middle East. By the end of the year, Zionist leadership had secured assurances from Ivan Maisky, a leading Soviet diplomat, that the USSR understood Zionist designs and, when it came time for them to be acted upon, the Soviets would, quote, certainly stand by them. Though the Russian Zionist Dan Pines claimed to have met with Stalin in the 1920s and received an endorsement for his activities, the first substantial sign that Maisky's support for Zionism was shared by Soviet leadership came in a meeting between President Roosevelt and Stalin in Yalta, February 11, 1945. In it, Roosevelt asked Stalin his thoughts on Zionism, to which he replied, quote, "In principle, I support Zionism, but there are difficulties with solving the Jewish question. Our experiment in Birobidzhan failed because the Jews prefer to live in cities." Roosevelt's translator, Charles Bolin, familiar with Stalin's earlier writings on nationalism, was stunned. It wasn't until 1947 that Soviet sympathies for Zionism became a matter of both public knowledge and material force. That year, the British Mandate for Palestine, in effect a temporary colonial arrangement in which an indigenous populace was ruled by a foreign body until deemed fit for self-determination, came to a close as British occupation proved increasingly untenable. Far from preparing Palestine for self-rule, as was its nominal ambition, the British Mandate was mostly used to transfer ownership of property to the absentee landlords in the UK homeland and to Zionist settlers, leaving the locals less able than ever to decide their own future. Consequently, Palestine's fate was to be determined by the United Nations, a body in which Palestinians lacked and continue to lack proper representation. It was in the midst of this crucial process, deliberating upon Palestine's future, that the Soviets finally made their support of Zionism known to the world. On May 14, 1947, Soviet representative to the United Nations, Andrei Gromyko, delivered a speech to the UN General Assembly that stunned Western observers, Zionist leaders, and the Soviet Union's own allies. In behavior truly beneath the spirit of basic communist solidarity, Palestine's own Moscow-aligned Communist Party knew nothing of the talks between Soviet diplomats and Zionist leaders to determine the future of their homeland. Gromyko's speech was certainly no more in keeping with the comradely ethic either. After an opening speech in which he restated the conventional Soviet judgment of British Mandate Palestine, condemning the bankruptcy of its system of administration, Gromyko turned to the indescribable sorrow and suffering endured by the Jewish people during the Holocaust. Having set the emotional scene, Gromyko pivoted to the crux of his speech, the situation facing displaced European Jews and the responsibility of the United Nations to resolve it. The fact that no Western European state has been able to ensure the defense of the elementary rights of Jewish people and to safeguard it against the violence of the fascist executioners explains the aspirations of the Jews to establish their own state. It would be unjust not to take this into consideration and to deny the right of the Jewish people to realize this aspiration. It would be unjustifiable to deny this right to the Jewish people, particularly in view of all that it has undergone during the Second World War. Acknowledging this fact, Gromyko identified 4 possible paths of action for the United Nations to take. 1. The establishment of a single Arab-Jewish state with equal rights for Arabs and Jews. 2. The partition of Palestine into 2 independent states, one Arab and one Jewish. 3. The establishment of an Arab state in Palestine without due regard for the rights of the Jewish population. 4. The establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine without due regard for the rights of the Arab population. This was hardly an unqualified endorsement of the Zionist position. Officially, the Soviet recommendation remained an independent, dual, democratic, homogeneous Arab-Jewish state as had always been the consensus of communists. However, should this ideal solution prove impossible to implement, the United Nations should remain open to the alternative of the partition of Palestine into two independent autonomous states, one Jewish and one Arab. Though merely rhetorical, any Soviet receptiveness to the possibility of a Jewish state in Palestine was unprecedented. That precedent now set, Gromyko's words were quickly followed by more from others. By the end of the year, the Soviet Union had not only abandoned its previous stance of anti-Zionism, but transformed into, in one historian's words, an ardent supporter of the Zionist cause. Most notably, though hardly an isolated incident, Semyon Sarapkin announced Soviet support for the partition of Palestine on October 13, 1947, making Soviet support for Zionism fully official. It took less than a month for Soviet pledges to lead to Soviet action. On November 29, 1947, among the most important days in Israeli history, the United Nations voted in favor of UNGA Resolution 181, the United Nations' official proposal for the partition of Palestine. Though the final tally, 33 in favor and 13 opposed, barely crossed the two-thirds threshold necessary for acceptance, an absence of Soviet support alone would not have caused Resolution 181 to fail. Crucially, however, Soviet support meant not only the support of the Soviet Union proper, but the Soviet bloc. Belarus, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Ukraine all voted in favor of Resolution 181 on Stalin's orders. Yugoslavia, to their immense credit, abstained. Had these nations stuck to their historical stance of anti-Zionism, the tally would have instead been 28 in favor and 18 opposed, far short of the two-thirds majority needed for ratification. Soviet support was indispensable for Zionism's success at this crucial juncture. Although it is impossible to know what an alternate history without Resolution 181 would look like, its success proved invaluable to Zionism in our timeline. Though only an internal recommendation by the UN General Assembly addressed to the UN Security Council, and therefore in no way legally binding, Zionists have long suggested that Palestinian and Arab leaderships somehow violated norms of international diplomacy by refusing the recommendations made. According to this popular narrative, the Nakba, Israel's horrific ethnic cleansing of over 700,000 Palestinians from their homeland, was a consequence of Palestine's own stubborn refusal to negotiate. It is claimed that, had partition been accepted in 1947, both Israel and Palestine today could celebrate independence. That this absurd narrative persists speaks volumes to the efficacy of Western propaganda and the enduring power of colonial mindsets against the right of non-Western peoples to self-determination. Israel's own leaders have made clear the falsity of this myth, with Israel's first Prime Minister Ben-Gurion stating in no uncertain terms that after the formation of a large army, we will abolish partition and expand to the whole of Palestine. Hardly a one-off statement, Gurion also said that I don't regard a state in part of Palestine as the final aim of Zionism, but as a means towards that aim. If he underestimated the difficulty with which Israel would expand, the recent October 8th ceasefire agreement, in which governance of the Gaza Strip is ceded to the so-called Board of Peace headed by President Trump, proves his goal has not been abandoned. Had the Soviet bloc's material support for Zionism been limited to its coordinated voting for Resolution 181, the defense that Stalin and associates did not know what was to come may have held some water, though no degree of support for settler-colonialism can be excused. In reality, Soviet support was extensive. While various trade embargoes and boycotts made direct Soviet support unfeasible, the USSR authorized Czechoslovakia to send heavy weapons to the newly formed Israeli army from January 1948 and October 1949 as part of Operation Balak. In sum, over $22 million worth of goods were sold to the Israelis, equivalent to over $500 million today. Ben-Gurion claimed in 1968, long after Soviet-Israeli relations soured, that the Czech arms deal was the greatest help we then had. It saved us, and without it, I very much doubt we could have survived the first month. It might be argued that these weapons were provided by the Soviet bloc only for the purpose of aiding Israel in the so-called Liberation War against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. According to the Zionist historian Martin Kramer, the guns arrived in the nick of time, allowing the Hanga to go on the offensive in the lead-up to independence. If the Soviets had in mind only to contribute to this offensive, however, one must reckon with the reality that the offensive to which Kramer innocuously refers is Plan Dalet, the illegal paramilitary operation through which over 450 Palestinian towns were wiped out. To have contributed to the liberation war and not the Nakba is an impossibility for the simple reason that the two were one and the same. That today's Stalinists are confused about this fact does not mean that Stalin himself shared their confusion. Far from objecting to the Nakba, Stalin gave it his seal of approval when, in December 1948, Soviet diplomats voted against a draft of UNGA Resolution 194, proposing Palestinian refugees be granted either the right to return to their homes or be financially compensated for their losses. The USSR and its satellites argued it would be preferable for the Jews to be given the opportunity to come to an agreement with the Arabs on this matter in the course of peace negotiations. Even the US and UK felt compelled to back Resolution 194 on paper, though neither ever acted to help realize in practice what they voted to support. In sum, Israel could hardly have asked for a better ally. Though it lasted only a few short years, Soviet support for Israel was unwavering, for which Israeli politicians never stopped being thankful. Abba Eban, Deputy Prime Minister of Israel from 1963 to 1966, said that for those 2 or 3 years, the Soviets were more consistent in their assertiveness in support of Israel than even the United States. There were no wobblings, no vacillations. Moshe Sharei, Israel's second prime minister, exaggerated only slightly when he claimed that during that period, the Security Council, the Russians operated not just as our allies, but our emissaries. The question this leaves us asking is, why? This is hardly the first time this question has been posed. It has been the subject of much professional speculation and debate for the better part of 80 years. The question has proven so difficult to answer that some, notably Walter Lecaire, have doubted whether the decision to support the establishment of a Jewish state was taken at the top level. In view of subsequent developments, it is at least possible that this course of action was recommended by some foreign ministry advisors and approved by Stalin in a fit of absent-mindedness. Though possible, Stalin is not a man traditionally characterized as absent-minded, and Molotov, Stalin's closest foreign policy advisor and one of the only men to both participate in the Russian Revolution and survive Stalin's purges, later recalled that everyone objected to a Jewish state but us, me and Stalin. Much of the difficulty that plagues this matter for bourgeois historians can be resolved if we abandon the Cold War insistence that Stalin's Marxism was genuine. There's no plausible interpretation of Stalin's actions which can understand them as a consequence of radical beliefs. If Stalin had sincere beliefs of any sort, it was in his capacity as a great Russian chauvinist, as Lenin once derisively referred to him. For all the difficulty Stalin's actions present the historian hell-bent on attributing them to a revolutionary Marxist perspective, they're made quite sensible when understood as the actions of a nationalistic imperialist. Stalin was not an entirely conventional nationalistic imperialist, of course, if for no other reason than his rise to power came through a communist party. Nevertheless, by the time Stalin came to power in 1928, Bolshevik radicalism was a shell of what it once was, because the revolutionary movement of which it was a leading part had withered and died. Russian society, still transitioning from feudalism to capitalism, was by no means ready for communism in 1917. The Bolsheviks hoped to overcome this hurdle through international support. Stalin himself wrote in 1924 that, for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, the efforts of one country are enough. To this, the history of our own revolution testifies. For the final victory of socialism, for the organization of socialist production, the efforts of one country, especially a peasant country like ours, are not enough. For this, we must have the efforts of the proletarians of several advanced countries. With the failure of the German Revolution in 1922, however, this hope of international support vanished, leaving the Bolsheviks in an unenviable position. How should a communist party go about leading a capitalist society? Can a communist party lead a capitalist society? Is it not bound to become a capitalist party in the process? This is precisely what happened with the German Social Democratic Party, whose brand of reformist Marxism produced the infamous farce of radicals supporting the First World War. Ironically, the Bolsheviks initially distinguished themselves for their rejection of this watered-down pseudo-Marxism, only to later find themselves in an analogous situation. Stalin's rise to power was one possible solution to the conundrum. He, more than anyone else, appreciated fully the precarity of the Bolshevik situation, where other leading Bolsheviks, most notably Red Army General Leon Trotsky, hoped the situation might still be salvaged and that revolutionary opportunities might present themselves. Stalin abandoned revolution in favor of what he called socialism in one country. In other words, in Stalin's view, what was good for Russia was good for the socialist movement. This falsehood swallowed, nationalist Realpolitik becomes indistinguishable from authentic radicalism. Why, then, was Zionism deemed beneficial in Soviet foreign policy? Though allied during the Second World War in a shared opposition to Nazi Germany, the interests of the Soviet Union, United States of America, and United Kingdom diverged radically in the post-war world, a fact for which all three prepared far in advance. For both the USSR and USA, Zionism presented an opportunity to contest UK influence over the Middle East. Though early Zionist settlement of Palestine had been facilitated by British colonialism, relations between imperial administrators and Zionist settlers were strained. There was little chance Britain's colonial successors would maintain close ties with their predecessors. They would instead turn to the emerging two superpowers, providing each with a unique opportunity to establish themselves in a region over which they previously held no influence. Those Stalinists who are aware of this history sometimes attempt to paint this as but one unfortunate episode in a long history of otherwise consistent proletarian internationalism, that even his support for Zionism was motivated by a greater scheme designed to advance the proletarian cause, even if it was misjudged and failed to come together as anticipated in the end. No doubt, it is true that Stalin's Zionism was insincere, as revealed by his consistently anti-Semitic pattern of behavior at home. And indeed, there was a greater scheme motivating Stalin's out-of-character actions, but it had nothing to do with advancing the proletarian cause. Far from it. Stalin was a proud advocate of socialism in one country, a profound bastardization of Marxism, and a complete abandonment of proletarian internationalism. With this nationalist schema in place, Stalin was free to equate the advancement of socialism with the advancement of Soviet interests. Soviet interests, like those of any state, are in reality those of the national ruling class, which by time of Stalin's ascent was no longer the revolutionary proletariat, but the growing state bureaucracy. Stalin's ploy to back Zionism was motivated by the same foreign policy rationale that has motivated every bourgeois nationalist in history. Even by this reactionary metric, however, Stalin's support for Zionism failed to pay off. Initially, and prefiguring Nikita Khrushchev's policy of peaceful coexistence that so many Stalinists find intolerably revisionist, Stalin believed the USSR, USA, and UK would each take their respective spheres of influence, leaving the rest to do in their own spheres as they saw fit. Having displaced the British and done far more than the US to secure Israel's future, Stalin naturally believed Israel would be a Soviet ally, thus establishing the Middle East as within the Soviet sphere of influence. But by just 1948, cracks in the Soviet-Israeli relationship began to show, with Stalin launching pogroms in search of an alleged Zionist conspiracy between Israel and Soviet Jews, and it was clear that Israel had aspirations to align itself with the West. Indeed, in many respects, the Zionists were already aligned with the West. As Ivan Maisky said of the Zionist leadership in a 1943 report to Molotov, they are a very nice people. They have all completed their education in Russian colleges or gymnasiums. We spoke about classical literature and the Russian language, but they think in English with an American accent. After the Nakba, Zionist leadership made no secret of its intentions. It was not Stalin's clever scheming that led to Soviet support for Israel, but Zionism's. What is perhaps most frustrating about this episode, aside from its direct contribution to one of today's most horrific evils, is how clearly it could have been seen coming. Indeed, a great many did see it coming. When the Middle Eastern subdivision of the International Department of the Central Committee of the All-Russian Communist Party, critiqued Molotov's belief that the Arab Communist Party should be disregarded in favor of fostering closer ties to the Zionists and the misguided belief that the former were far too ineffectual to be worth their while. The subdivision's leader was promptly fired and replaced by someone more accommodating. The Arab Communist parties also recognized that warm Soviet-Israeli relations could not last, and attempted to convince Soviet leadership of this to no avail. When the Soviet betrayal of the Arab peoples was revealed to the world in Gromyko's speech, it was the local communist parties who suffered. Previously strong relations between the Palestinian Communist Party and the communist parties of neighboring Arab nations like Egypt broke down completely, and the setbacks were not just political. Communist Party headquarters in Damascus and Aleppo were sacked by justifiably angry mobs. This discontent was then seized upon by the bourgeois governments of Syria and Lebanon to outright ban communist political activities in their borders. In some sense, Stalin should have known better, but we shouldn't be surprised that he didn't. Though many historians believe Stalin was a true believer, someone who sincerely believed his own propaganda, this does not preclude his beliefs having been self-serving. In any case, Stalin's interest and those of the Soviet bureaucracy were not, and had not been for a long time, the interests of the proletariat, Russian or otherwise. Soviet support for Zionism, though a tactical mistake, was not a momentary lapse in an otherwise solid record of proletarian internationalism, but one especially egregious episode in a long history of stabbing the international working class in the back. When Trotsky wrote his masterpiece, Revolution Betrayed in 1935, he had in mind the October Revolution in Russia. He underestimated how many more revolutions Stalin would go on to betray, some of which had yet to even be made. In recent years, an effort has been made by some on the left to reclaim the legacy of the Soviet Union from its detractors, to call attention to the many achievements made in Soviet society that go routinely unacknowledged in mainstream historiography and complicate the otherwise comically one-sided narrative we're taught in school and in mainstream culture. Inasmuch as this is the case, such an exercise may be worthwhile. Even though the Soviet Union failed to overcome capitalism, and thus its horrors cannot be laid at the feet of authentic communism, it is fair to ask if revolution is worth risking if failure means the gulag and nothing more. But the leap to resurrecting Stalin as a hero of the proletariat is one step too far, one that goes beyond correcting distortions and valorizes the architect of counter-revolution as the revolution's savior. To the extent that the Soviet Union had achievements, and it certainly had more than its fair share, these occurred either before Stalin's ascent to power in 1928, or occurred despite rather than because of Stalin's leadership. Even the most notable exception, the rapid industrialization of the Soviet economy in the 1930s, was made possible only by the extreme exploitation of the Soviet proletariat. As Neil Faulkner writes in his excellent A People's History of the Russian Revolution, the aim was mass production to build state power. Russia's rulers thus became personifications of state capitalist accumulation. But they also used their power to reward themselves richly, even as they plundered the peasantry, cut wages, increased work pressure, and filled the gulags with slave laborers. Just as, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia and many former Soviet satellite states continued to note the consequences of Stalin's leadership at home, so too did the Palestinian people continue to suffer the consequences of his leadership abroad. To reappraise Stalin as a revolutionary hero does not only a disservice to those who suffered by his hand in the past, but those who continue to suffer from it today. If we are to contribute to the fight against the Palestinian genocide and for working-class self-emancipation, we cannot venerate a man who did so much to undermine both goals in the past.